Hello and welcome to another edition of All for All. I'm Richard RJ Eskow of the Zero Hour Report. The conversation today, or the talk today, is entitled, I'm calling it Ass Backwards, Why the Democrats Can't Lead. And I guess I should explain the title. The ass, or donkey, as we all know, is the symbol of the Democratic Party. And I say that backwards because too many people on the left, at least the what they call the progressive left, keep looking to the Democratic Party for leadership, which is exactly backward. The Democratic Party at times can be forced to follow, although it can be as challenging as trying to get an actual donkey to go where you want it to go. But so it's a tool, but it is never going to lead. So it's, as I say, ass backwards to expect the Democrats to lead when, as we'll talk about in this conversation, there are very sound structural reasons why Democrats can't lead. So when I say that, I'm not being vitriolic. I'm not being mean or cruel. There are structural reasons behind what the Democratic Party does. And that's why I think it's time for people who want real change to look beyond it. It's not, they don't do what they do because they're stupid or blind, as a lot of progressives seem to think. They have a perfectly rational reason, which I'll get to in a second. But first, let's talk a little bit about some progressives and their response to the 2024 election. I won't name the first person I'm talking about because he's a nice enough man in his own way. And you can look up the article if you want, but it's not about basting any individuals here. But right after the election, a column was posted in the Guardian. And the headline was, "The Democrats must become an anti-establishment party." Now, this person got his analysis largely correct, writing that the real median wage of the bottom 90% is stuck where it was in the early 1990s, even though the economy is more than twice as large. Most of the economy's gains have gone to the top. Can't argue with that. Trump gave voice to the anger that caused, and Kamala Harris did not. Can't argue with that. Then he goes on to say the real lesson of the 2024 election is that Democrats must not just give voice to the anger, but also explain how record inequality has corrupted our system and pledge to limit the political power of big corporations. He goes on, talks about a lot of things Democrats have gotten wrong. He then says Democrats, and I'm using him mostly as an example, Democrats must focus on winning back the working class. Haven't we heard that a lot since November? They should demand paid family leave, Medicare for all, free public higher education, stronger unions, higher taxes on great wealth, and housing credits that will generate the biggest boom in residential home construction since the Second World War, and so on. He concludes by saying the Democratic Party should use this inflection point to shift ground from being the party of well-off corporate. You get the idea, right? And must become, and I quote, an anti-establishment party ready to shake up the system on behalf of the vast majority of Americans. Now, I ask you, I'm sure this is written with good intentions, but do any of you listening really believe that there's a chance in hell that the Democratic Party will become, quote, an anti-establishment party ready to shake up the system on behalf of the vast majority of Americans, end quote? The idea seems absurd because honestly, it is absurd. And again, shortly, I'll start talking about why I think that is. But I also speak from personal experience when I say, having written now for decades on what the left needs to do, including, just like this writer does, just as so many people do, going through the polling numbers and explaining to people why, trying to let the Democrats know that the left agenda is popular and this will help them politically as well as being a good thing for the economy, et cetera, et cetera. But there comes a point, at least in my life, when, and I think in the life of a lot of people who are genuinely on the left, where the idea of continuing to prostrate yourself before a party that doesn't want to listen is just too frustrating. And you have to realize you're not getting anywhere that way, and you have to choose a different direction. Now, there are all sorts of pieces talking about what, quote unquote, we need to do. Democrats need to drop their elitism if we want to win again. We need to do some soul searching. That's another piece. And then Ken Martin, who's newly elected head of the DNC, we need to regain the trust of families and communities. We need to address people's pain head on, and so on. But the problem is, there's no we. The Democratic Party at various points in history has been part of a kind of popular front that included unions and civil rights groups and others at various points during its history, but not today. So who is this we we're talking about? Now, of all the responses to the Democratic Party's loss that offered suggestions, for the party. My favorite, I think, the most interesting one was in The Nation by Pete Davis. He talked about overhauling what he called the party's quote unquote civic structure by creating maps and membership cards, mutual aid programs. And Pete Davis writes, quote, by pairing local participation with centralized coordination, the national leadership and the local membership of the party could communicate ideas, concerns, mandates, and marching orders back and forth. But there's a problem. The problem isn't the advice. The problem is the intended audience. It just gets dispiriting, as I say, to just spend one's life supplicating to an institution that has a powerful reason to not listen to anything we say. Who really believes, I'll say it again, that today's Democrats will become an anti-establishment party that shakes up the system, or that its leaders would willingly swap, quote unquote, mandates and marching orders with scattered party chapters around the country? That's kind of like expecting Walgreens to fix its disastrous losses by becoming a self-governing syndicate of worker cooperatives. It's a nice idea. It's not going to happen. But it's time to talk about why. Why is the Democratic Party so intransigent? I'll say in a word, the Democratic Party, like Walgreens, has a business model. They don't call it a business model, but it's real. It's pretty clear once you start looking for it what it is. And its design forces party leaders to reject or just placate the genuine left while doing nothing to meet its needs or the needs of the working people the left represents. That's why I say leftists need to accept that and look elsewhere for leadership. We'll talk about that a little more in a second. Those of us who follow politics know that for years, the idea that the Democrats had any plan or model would have seemed absurd. It was back in the very early 20th century that the satirical newspaper figure, Mr. Dooley, said, I do not belong to any organized political party. I'm a Democrat. But things have changed, and I would pin the change largely. Well, if you look at the history of Democratic politicians, Jimmy Carter, who was a wonderful ex-president, didn't have any kind of structure and didn't really guide his party. In fact, the opposite was true. It was full of conflict and chaos, but the chaos ended, as far as I'm concerned, in the 1990s when the so-called New Democrats under Bill Clinton reorganized the party using a definitely corporate style blueprint. It was around that time, for example, that the Clinton administration brought business speak into the White House. For example, remember the quote unquote National Partnership for Reinventing Government, end quote. Its goal was government that, quote, works better, costs less, and gets results Americans care about, end quote. I don't know, but it sounds a little bit like Elon Musk and Doge to me. So let's talk about this business model they don't call a business model. I think it, at least for me, it helps explain some of the party's seemingly baffling decisions, as well as its seemingly never-ending hostility toward the left. The product in this business model is corporate friendly public policy. Why? Because the revenue in this model primarily comes from corporations and wealthy individuals. We can call them customers who finance the party's mega $1 million and now $1 billion campaigns, and also fund a vast and enormous superstructure of think tanks, consulting firms, vendors, and all sorts of other people. These satellite companies and organizations around the Democratic Party employ thousands upon thousands of people who in turn help shape the party's direction. Now, how did this business model evolve? How did it come into being? Well, one high point, if you want to call it that, or one turning point in the history was probably the court ruling of Buckley versus Valeo, and the donor-friendly court rulings that followed, really unleashing there was always big money in politics, but really unleashing it, triggering a dramatic rise in political contributions. The New Democrats, I would say, correctly saw this as both a threat and an opportunity. The threat was that all that money was going to go to Republicans who had more business-friendly policies, so they'd get a torrent of cash, and Democrats would be left struggling to catch up. But the New Dems, I should say, figured out they could pitch themselves as quote unquote business-friendly Democrats and tap lots of this big donor money for themselves. So that was how the revenue part of the model started to form. Contributions flowed in. And as I say, not just for campaigns, these corporate and billionaire donors also funded an ever-expanding democratic universe of think tankers, consultants, staffers, and others with an accompanying corporate culture. You know how every organization has an organizational culture. Well, that goes the same. The same is true for Democrats and people who work for this larger democratic ecosystem or matrix of organizations. I call it the I call it the neoliberal prosperity gospel. This prosperity gospel told the recipients of it, the policy analysts, the political consultants, the economists, all the other people, that they could get this donor largesse, earn great incomes, and at the same time feel they were doing good works. So, doing good while doing well. All that this corporate culture and neoliberal prosperity gospel asked in return is that they believe wholeheartedly in the neoliberal policies they promoted, or at least that they act like they do. So the next step was, which occurred in parallel, was Democrats needed to pivot rightward without losing most of their base voters. That was a challenge. How in this business model do you get the revenue from the ultra wealthy and corporate interests without having the entire working class turn its back on you? Their solution, I have to say, was elegant, and it had a couple elements to it. One was that rather than attack working class politics, they pronounced it obsolete. The Democrats, the insider Democrats, rebranded themselves as innovators and fetishized the suddenly hip Silicon Valley corporate culture. Then they sent the old timers out to pasture. Now, I'm old enough to remember that in the 60s and 70s and 80s, if you were politically idealistic, the last thing you wanted to emulate was the business world. But by making the business world, quote unquote, hip, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and so on, suddenly that changed. And every lurch to the right that the Democratic Party took was labeled as a quote unquote innovation. That's even true of the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, which was a massive and eventually catastrophic giveaway to predatory financial institutions, but it was sprinkled with this innovation fairy dust. At its signing, Bill Clinton declared that this banker-driven law would, and I quote, modernize our financial services laws stimulating greater innovation, there's that word again, and competition in the financial services industry, close quote. Deregulation, and deregulation being a very conservative idea, deregulation, said Bill Clinton, and I quote, is the wave of the future. The bill was even given a new name, quote, the Financial Services Modernization Act of 1999, end quote. Modernize, innovation, wave of the future. Quick, get my jetpack. With all that modernity floating around, voters might be forgiven for not realizing that the bill actually turned the clock back some 70 years or so to the roaring 20s and the crash of 29. The Democrats' next leader after Clinton took a different tack. In 2007, Barack Obama positioned himself as part of a quote unquote Joshua generation, named for the children of the Israelites who reached the promised land in the Bible. So they weren't the pioneers. They weren't the ones who took the Exodus. They were the ones who first generation that benefited from it. Now that's an interesting image because it suggests that the journey is done and the destination has been reached, doesn't it? But of course, that's not the case. Obama called the Black activists of the 1960s, and I quote, the Moses generation, meaning that they had led them to the promised land where they already were, or led us. He also pointedly called them, quote, the previous generation. I thought that speech where he said those things was a kind of a very subtle but pointed thank you next to the greatest heroes of a generation, the leaders of the civil rights movement, and in Selma, no less. But hey, let's give credit where credit is due. This plan, this business model, it actually worked for a while. And let's talk about that. Bill Clinton was able to win the presidency by using the sort of slick packaging and youth-oriented tools that were already so common in the corporate world around Madison Avenue. Clinton used that kind of tactic and the same kind of appeal to win the presidency. He did lose Congress, but then after the financial crisis of 2008, under this model, collecting this big money and all of that, Democrats won the presidency in 2008 and both houses of Congress. Now, that is tragic when we look back on it, because one of the reasons, besides, in fact, I would say even more so than the business model, the main reason they won is that they were actually able to present themselves as innovators, their new marketing tactic, and that met the moment because the entire economic system needed an overhaul, needed a redesign, needed to be really rethought. It needed imagination and creativity and all the things that the sales pitch for the business model said the Democrats had, but which unfortunately they didn't have. So we can say that while this business model helped Democrats win the presidency in both houses of Congress, it was also why the Democrats couldn't keep them. The consequences of the financial crisis made it impossible to meet the needs and the aspirations of the moment in the United States and protect the model. So Democrats had to make a choice. They chose and they lost. They lost the House in 2010. They lost the Senate in 2014. They lost the presidency in 2016. Again, the tragic loss of an opportunity, perhaps of a lifetime, for major change. So it cost them in the end. How could you, after all, address the financial emergency and please the big donor customers on Wall Street or in large corporations? So it also explains, when you think about this business model, revenue, large donations, product, business-friendly policy. It also explains why the party was so enthusiastic and adamant about rejecting Bernie Sanders on the campaign I worked for him on, which was 2016, and again in 2020. They rejected the most popular politician in the country consistently, without question, Bernie Sanders, twice. And they did it because Bernie Sanders posed an existential threat to that model. His economic proposals undermined the product, which was Wall Street friendly and corporate friendly policy, and his ability to raise enormous sums of money from small donor cash threatened the revenue stream that the business model was built on. The Democrats, I believe, made the choice that it was better to lose occasionally, even to someone like Donald Trump, than sacrifice the cash flow that finances their centrist campaigns and supports these thousands of party operatives in and around the party establishment. So the party knifed Sanders and anointed Joe Biden, who is a bit less reactionary than expected, I'll say that. And the Congressional Progressive Caucus and other elected progressives, including Bernie, worked diligently under Biden and with Biden and got some good appointments like Lena Khan at the FTC. They passed some legislation that exceeded expectations. I wouldn't say it's nearly what we need, but they exceeded expectations. But I would also say, because of the business model, the progressives in the House and Senate paid a price for their loyalty. They arguably traded away some of their street clout, if you want to call that, by among other things, endorsing Joe Biden more than a year before the election, helping in their own small way to foreclose the possibility of a primary challenge, and leaving them, more importantly, silenced and unable to argue openly and effectively for popular progressive ideas. When's the last time especially before the November 2024 election, when's the last time you heard a progressive Democrat say it's time for Medicare for all, for example? There's another element of this we need to talk about too, which is that institutional Democrats tried to protect and defend their conservative economic ideas by adopting a new and ahistorical take on social justice, one that pitted what came to be known as identity politics against class politics. It was used against Sanders and the left quite unfairly. And by severing, for example, civil rights for Black people from economic rights for Black people, they absolutely divorced themselves from the long tradition of civil rights up to and through the life of Martin Luther King and afterwards. The movement for Black civil rights has always been inextricably economic as well as social. As Dr. King said, what's the point of integrating a luncheon counter if a Black person can't afford a hamburger at that counter? But today, their ploy shows what happens when working people feel pressed. Today, polls show that voters associate Democrats more closely with quote unquote sociocultural issues than with class solidarity and economic rights. Now, some leftists, by leftists, I should say, I primarily mean economic leftists, hoped that President Biden's more progressive actions, at least more progressive than his predecessors, anti-monopoly efforts, for example, some aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act, like drug pricing, they were hoping that showed that the party was finally embracing the left. Not a chance. And the 2024 election proved that. Why? Well, it's pretty simple. Follow the money. The Democratic presidential campaign, when you include both Biden fundraising and then Kamala Harris fundraising, raised an estimated $2.15 billion by October of 2024, including at least $50 million each from billionaires Michael Bloomberg and Bill Gates. Its primary funding vehicle, to compile and spend this money was called Future Forward. There it is again, right? That salesmanship of future and innovation. Future Forward reportedly spent nearly billion making and airing ads, some 450 plus $1 million worth of ads. Now, this is an important lesson. Future Forward reportedly, quote, made and tested more than 1,000 ads and conducted over 7 million voter surveys to test which ads would be most effective to air, end quote. That was a bid for full spectrum dominance of the American political consciousness, and it failed. And now, $2 billion or more, and a partial observer might say, how can anyone spend that money and still lose? The answer, paradoxically, is that I think the money is why she lost. It appears to have inhibited, whatever you think of the sincerity of the Democratic message, it appears to have inhibited Kamala Harris's ability to propose better policies for working people. Instead, she offered what even the New York Times called a Wall Street approved economic pitch, tamer, for example, than Joe Biden's, then failing to address voter concerns. But let's face it, if Bill Gates and Bloomberg each give you $50 million, you're probably on the wrong track economically. And during her 100-day campaign, some observers also sensed a change in the candidate and her running mate. Their seeming spontaneity gave way to what looked like consulted, scripted, donor-funded, business model-friendly talking points. As I used to say, if you remember the Brad energy, if not, look it up. There was Brat energy in the Harris campaign in the summer, and it became the PAC energy of the fall. But this doesn't mean I'm not trying to bum you out by saying the Democrats can't lead. As I say, they can be used at times. So let's talk a little bit about that before we go, and we'll talk about it a lot in this series going forward. There are alternatives, great alternatives for left action, once the left finally accepts that it won't be led by the Democratic Party. That party apparently sees inequality, automation, gig work, and globalization as acceptable byproducts of the business model. But there are really promising signs for the left. There's continued popular support for unions. That includes the 2017 strikes by red state teachers. The Hollywood workers' strike was very popular. Auto workers' strike was very popular. Boeing employees' strike was very popular. Spontaneous movements like Occupy, Black Lives Matter, the Women's March, they show that people can still self-organize. And in terms of polling, well, large majorities support steep tax hikes for billionaires and for accumulated wealth. 59% of voters, nearly two-thirds, believe the government has a responsibility to ensure healthcare coverage for everyone. Nearly three-quarters of those polled in 2022 believes that the government should expand Social Security, something Joe Biden promised he would do in the 2020 campaign and then never mentioned again once the campaign was over. And the left has always stood in opposition to corruption and money in politics, something that voters in both parties also despise. On the other hand, 70% of people polled by Gallup expressed confidence in organized labor, which is well ahead of both Congress and big business. Democratic and Republican voters are equally averse, according to polling, to financial institutions and large corporations. They don't like them. If the Democratic Party won't take them on, we have to create our own movements that will do it. There also seems to be a sort of inchoate but slowly coagulating yearning for class solidarity. It's not class consciousness, not yet, but it could change. That's why I think Pete Davis of The Nation was onto something important with civic structure. It won't be through the Democratic Party, but a movement that is also a community and a home is very much needed. So look, the Democratic Party is one half of America's political duopoly. We have to acknowledge that. So activism within the party can be the right tactic at times, but the Democratic Party can be used as a vehicle. It should not be used as a map. The best place to look for leadership is not in celebrity politicians who are essentially sales reps for a party run like a business with other businesses. We'll find the leadership we need in grassroots political parties and activist organizations. We'll also find the leadership we need in ourselves and in our neighbors and in great ideas of the past and present, which I hope we'll talk to in future episodes. So as always, I look forward to your thoughts and responses. And as always, thanks for listening.